Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark, and we are looking at a passage in Psalm 46, verses 8 through 11. So verse 10 is a very familiar verse. Be still and know that I am God. Maybe you've heard this verse before. The concept of this verse you can find first in the context of when Israel was leaving the bondage of Egypt. God parts the Red Sea so they can escape Pharaoh's pursuing army, and Moses gave these instructions to the people just before the waters parted in Exodus 14, verses 13 and 14. It says, "But Moses told the people, don't be afraid, just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again. The Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm." So standing still meant that the Israelites had to trust God to protect them from the Egyptians. So when the psalmist made this reference, note that he was doing so within the context of a passage that was describing God's protection and provision over the city of God. So yesterday we observed that a city is a collective concept rather than an individualistic one. And it's important to note that the enemies mentioned in Psalm 46 are a collective reference as well. Every nation it speaks about throughout the world. The command to be still is spoken to the entire group. So all believers who are in the city of God should be still. In the context of this, to be still is clearly a reference to submitting to God's rule and waiting on him. And so if you read it like that, let every group or every nation, every city be still and know that I am God. So the Psalms often portray the nations of the world in chaos and at war against God's sovereign rule. And early in the collection of the Psalms, this imagery is made plain. Psalm 2, 1 and 2 says, "Why are the nations so angry? Why did they waste their time with futile plans? The kings of the earth prepare for battle. The rulers plot together against the Lord and against his entrusted one, his anointed one." It also made clear what the end result will be for those nations who rage against God's rule. They will submit. If you find in verses 10 through 12 of chapter 2, "Now then, you kings, act wisely. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. Submit to God's royal Son, or he will become angry and you will be destroyed in the midst of all your activities. For his anger flares up in an instant. But what joy for all who take refuge in him." So the command to be still is for the entire group in the city of God. But it is also an indirect command to every nation. For us to understand, God rules over all people. The benefits of the city do not come without submission to God. That's the thing we need to understand. God rules the entire world, but the benefits come through submission. So these perspectives teach us that the benefits of the city imply submission to God. Therefore, when the psalmist speaks of God as our refuge and strength, for example, submitting to God is implied. And God's protection and provision come along with submitting. We cannot claim access to God's blessings and benefits without also accepting that he must be God and God alone in our lives. Verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be honored by every nation. I will be honored throughout the world." So, Jay, in our modern context, we're not crossing the Red Sea right now. What does be still look like in our modern context?
Well, I think for the average American, be still in the culture we live in today is intentional focus. We often use this term in the church, quiet time, where you're just intentional about disengaging, unplugging from everything, focusing on God and who God is. I think being still in that concept is so vitally important for our daily spiritual health. But as I begin to work through this, I begin to see other things that I hadn't really applied, in the sense of sometimes I need to be still in before I make decisions, before I respond to people. Because if I were still before God more often, I would create a lot less problems in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the simple reality of it. But then I began to think it through even more than that. And you were reading through and talking about, giving an example of the Egyptians, and Moses challenging the people to be still, be calm in your heart, knowing it wasn't they that were denying the problem and the dilemma they were in. They had a bad situation. They were pinned in on one side. They had this army that was pursuing them, going to close in. They had this Red Sea in front of them, so that was blocking them in. It wasn't they denied the problem, but he was challenging them to say, God's already demonstrated who he is to you. He's already delivered you. You have to take another step and trust. And I think being still is an ongoing, everyday, for me, multiple times a day, choice and decision. The thing I had really not processed through before looking at this in greater detail is if Pharaoh and the army of Egypt had have chosen, even as unbelievers, to be still and recognize and know that he was God, there's no collapse of the Red Sea when they go in. There's no drowning. There's no loss of the horses and chariots, the soldiers. Doesn't mean that they would have ever been necessarily in right relationship with God, but they would have avoided a lot of catastrophe, even as a quote, evil, sinful, oppressive nation to the people of God, if they had chosen to recognize God and to be still. And so this application is twofold. It's to believers as well as unbelievers.
I was sitting here thinking about all of the times that we chase after things that we should allow to exit. And when we read that story of Israel and the Exodus from Egypt, we talk about it in terms of Israel is spiritual. Egypt is the evil one.
Sinful, yeah.
Yeah. It don't take long for us to figure out that Egypt ain't so spiritual, right? I mean, Israel's not so spiritual.
Yeah.
They're moaning and complaining a couple of days after they get on the other side of this piece. But I see it in relationships sometimes where in Pharaoh's case, what happened was it got so bad, right? So much pressure was put on. He said, okay, I can't stand anymore. I'm going to let you go. And he lets them go, and he thinks, no, maybe I need them back.
Yeah, and so his decision was not what the scripture says, was not about submission or yielding.
Right.
It was relief in the moment.
Right.
And there's a big difference.
That's right. But after the pressure's off, he goes, no, we can't lose them. We ain't going to have no brick makers, all of the things that's right. We're not going to be able to do it. Let's go after them. And he paid a price. The place I see this the most is in relationships, but I think it happens in careers. I think it happens in ministry, which could be a career. So many places. Even there are times when, boy, I got to be careful right here. People leave the fellowship, so that's in a relationship issue. They reach a point where they leave your church, right? And in our haste, we will often chase, right, to try to correct the situation. Or it could be a boyfriend, girlfriend situation. It could even be a marriage, and I'm not promoting divorce, but I think there are some situations you need to extract yourself from.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but as it relates to marriage relationships, sometimes that time apart is essential to be able to think through, process, change thought patterns, behaviors. Like you said, one chases the other too soon, but before significant changes that are beneficial have taken place.
There's a job, and they're like, you know what? I don't want anybody to think I can't handle this job, or I'm not good enough for this job. And so we press on in things that we should have let go instead of just being still, waiting on God. It doesn't mean passivity.
That's right.
That's not what I mean. But I think that there are times, all of us, when we talk about being still, I think most of the time we think about things like you described as you started: quiet time, days off. And I'm not saying those things aren't important,
Right.
but pausing before speaking, waiting before taking action.
Yeah.
You know, I'm an action-oriented person. There are some things that I wait on, right? You know, as I've gotten older, I won't buy a vehicle. You know, I won't roll up and
Yeah, it just,
and buy one.
yeah, it's a, that smells good. I like that one. Okay, give me that one at 14%.
I won't do that anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah, and some of that comes with maturity, just the patience.
sure.
But there are other times that I was just having a conversation this morning on the phone, and I said my nature is to go at it and try to resolve it. But my wisdom says that's a bad idea. You should just let it go and wait, you know.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do.
It is hard to do. But if you learn to practice, quote, being still, sometimes it's such a benefit. You know, I've even noticed it as relates to church in people that, you know, maybe they come in fresh and new and everything looks wonderful and they sound great, you know, and they're articulate and they seem to be bright, and you're like, oh gosh, this is the answer, you know, to my prayers. This could be a high capacity person. But if you be still and wait just a little while and observe and listen, all of a sudden you start seeing and sensing things that you're like, I need to slow down here. I need to seek God more. I need to be patient here before I make a decision. And, you know, you talked about it financially. You know, it's one of the greatest tools, I'm convinced, that people can give themselves to be financially healthy is learn to be still. Just wait, defer. And, you know, then if things are still the same, you feel the same way, the numbers all add up, you know, the next day, 3 days later, a week from now, so be it. But if you just wait, oftentimes you'll save yourself a lot of pain and heartache.
If be still is a submission issue, what does submission look like? It's not just being physically still or quiet.
To me, submission is simply recognizing that there is someone or something superior, wiser than you that you're looking to, that you're trying to get some input. You know, we think in terms of certainly God meets that definition, and He wants to be all things to us in that regard. But sometimes yielding or being submissive is going to another person, even humbling yourself to go to another person who has more experience in that area and say, look, I need some help here. I need some advice. I need some insight. I'm struggling in this area. That's recognizing that somebody else has more authority or experience in an area that can be beneficial to you. And sometimes we don't do those things simply because we don't want to humble and yield ourselves.
I just had this conversation with somebody in the last week. They were saying, I was like, you know, if you had asked, because I had some, and they knew I had some specific experience about something they were doing. If you had asked, I would have told you. And they said, I wanted to look like I was important, you know, that I knew what I was doing. You know, I wanted to be independent. And I was like, but that's stupid. Yeah. Right? That's a stupid thing to prove. Yeah. Because there are people who know things that I don't know, about things I don't know about, and have a lot more experience than I have. And it would benefit me if I just asked them occasionally, hey, what could happen here?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Psalms.